Oh, yeah. Do you want to come? Thank you. So as our commentator, let me introduce Professor Mikhail Karayanni. He's based at the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he holds the Bruce W. Wayne Chair in International Law. His main research areas are private international law and interreligious law, civil procedure, and multiculturalism. His many publications, among them a book titled Conflicts in a Conflict with Oxford University Press that is scheduled to come out this year.
Thank you. This is an especially challenging theme and a well-articulated argument, and it was very challenging for me since I do share much of the sentiment that underlines the argument. But nonetheless, I'm a commentator and I need to make some comments. With some I do have a passion for, and this is what I would like to do in my comment. First of all, I found your paper to be broad and narrow at the same time. I found it narrow because you kind of circle around one accommodation, which is the exemption. And then you make a whole thesis out of that particular example. But then if accommodations are of a number of forms, then I think to make the claim you are making, you should also consider other forms of accommodations, which I didn't find in the paper itself. You talk about exemptions from discrimination or anti-discrimination laws, and this has been a very serious topic in the U.S. You brought a couple of cases. There's a number of other cases, like Bob Jones, with religious institutions discriminating on the basis of race, right? Other forms discriminate openly against women. But really to treat religion honestly, I mean, religion is about discrimination, isn't it?
It is?
It is about discrimination, right? I mean, would a Jew have a right to join the Protestant church? I mean, we can justify why a church, a mosque, or a synagogue would want to discriminate against non-members. If you don't, then there is no claim for religion. And why do we accept these and we don't accept other forms, right? That's one argument, is that you're making a case out of a very powerful example, but you're kind of disregarding other examples that might make sense, right? Another narrow aspect of the paper is that you go into discussion and figuring out and defining what liberal democracy is about, but you only take what McConnell is saying about why we need this kind of an exemption, okay? But if you look into the literature on multiculturalism, pluralism, toleration, you find a whole other set of arguments saying why we should accommodate religious groups, right? Like in the U.S., you kind of take for granted that you accommodate the Native Americans. And the Native Americans' authority over their tribes is sovereigns, right? They're even labeled as sovereigns within the U.S. constitutions. You take for granted that, well, we should accommodate the African Americans by granting them affirmative actions. And that is also kind of challenging in terms of liberalism. But then we ask ourselves, why do we find these accommodations? What are the justifications? Is it just because we have a meta kind of a entity that we want to give voice for? Or there are other kind of justifications that we as liberals would want to take them into consideration, even though the group is not aligned with these considerations, right? I mean, this is what makes multiculturalism really challenging set of theories, right? We accommodate illiberal groups. We're not speaking about accommodating these very
Yes.
open societies. We're accommodating illiberal groups, and we kind of disregard why these groups are asking for accommodations, and they might have all kinds of intentions. But we're doing it out of some kind of consideration that we have independent of what that group is claiming. Okay? And I can get into more examples from the Israeli scenery later on. So, in a sense, I found this, or the argument, being too narrow, that it is focused on one kind of accommodation but disregards a whole other group of accommodations, and it is only focused on what McConnell and company are saying about justifications, while disregarding a whole set of theories that also support the jurisdiction of different religious groups. And I think this brings me to my argument why I think it's broad, because you don't make the distinctions between minorities and majorities. I mean, some of these arguments that you're putting forward and you're exempting and you're accommodating happens to be the Christian dominant majority in the US, but I think that the game might change, and it can change dramatically if you can make a distinction between the majority and the minority, and then you can find, continuing with my first argument, a whole set of new arguments why it's proper. A third theme that I would want to bring up, and it hasn't been discussed, but I think there is something in having accommodations of first order and having religious accommodations of a second order. You kind of take it for granted that you have a Western ideal of a democracy. But then there are other systems where things are different, right? Where there's a nation state, you have Europe with some privileges for some of the religious groups, right? And you have that in various kind of degrees. France, Germany, England, they would have different kinds of interests. And you have the nation states such as Israel and other Middle Eastern countries. Now, once you think of what you're calling the justifications, I can understand some of the sentiment when it's first order, it's one for all. But once the state would take a position in favor of a certain group, then there are other issues involved. One is, well, what do you offer in terms of citizenships to those who do not belong to this major group for which the state was established? Actually, the millet system, and this is interesting when you speak of sovereignty. Millet is a Turkish word, and it is translated into the nation. I mean, this is the nation we, the Ottomans, would give jurisdiction to handle the issues of these sub-nations within us. Now, we can speak volumes about where did this come from, but one issue which was dominant, that the Ottomans took Islam as a state religion. And once they have done so, then there was a vacuum, and that needed to be filled with something else, and that something else was the nations that were established for those who do not belong. Take Israel, which is also particularly challenging, not only because it's a Jewish state and it is defined as such constitutionally, and you have non-Jews and they do have still these millets. But take, for instance, the Hasidic community, which exactly believes that there is no sovereign other than God. And there is no law that is applicable to me other than the Torah, the Bible, right? Are they therefore not entitled to accommodation if this group is saying this in the U.S., in Brooklyn, which I think they would share still the same sentiment, would that make them ineligible for accommodations in terms of the American legal system? I don't think so, because I think that there's still this sphere in a democracy, in liberalism, where you can still justify accommodating these different minorities. Okay. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much.